I think we're about ready to start. Thank you all so much for being patient as we're waiting for our neighbors and our community members to find a spot to park their vehicles and make their way to Old Town. My name is Alicia Romero. I'm the head curator and curator of history at the Albuquerque Museum. This talk today is in celebration of the other Route 66, 100 years of people, identity, and place in Albuquerque. As we all know and have heard all year long, this is a centennial year-long celebration of Route 66. So it is a great pleasure that I have to introduce our speaker today. Candacy Taylor is the leading Green Book expert in the country. Her best-selling book, Overground Railroad, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America, made the New York Times most notable books of the year, Oprah Magazine's top 26 travel books, and National Geographic's top 10 list of books by women. Taylor is a National Geographic explorer, and her projects have been funded by the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Park Service, and the National Trust. Her work has been featured in over 80 media outlets, including The Atlantic, CBS Sunday Morning, The Economist, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, The New Yorker, Newsweek, Fortune, and Time Magazine. Taylor was a fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University under the direction of Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. She then curated the Negro Motorist Green Book, a Smithsonian exhibition that toured 14 U.S. museums from 2020 to 2025. Ms. Taylor is currently living on the road, conducting field research through 2028. Please join me in welcoming Candacy Taylor to this stage.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out and coming inside on such a sunny day, but it's always sunny here, right? Because it's New Mexico. I'm honored to be here, and I love the show. I think that, this whole theory of a new or different way or a more inclusive way to look at Route 66 is always someplace where I want to be, so we'll get started here. Let me get my... All right. Here we go. So I stumbled onto the Green Book by accident. I was actually commissioned to write a travel guide on Route 66. I had been documenting different segments and subcultures of America for about 15 years at that point. And when I started looking at who was writing about Route 66, 95% of, at least 95, it was probably more like 99%, of the people who had written extensively about Route 66 and had big travel books were mostly white males. And when I thought, there were half the sundown towns, half the counties were sundown towns on Route 66, it's like, well, how did black people drive Route 66? And because I asked that question, it led me down the rabbit hole of research that I'd love to go down. Because I thought, we're celebrating these white suburban families and these chrome-finned Chevys and everybody getting their kicks on Route 66. And I was struck by all the nostalgia that was related to this experience. And again, when I found out that there were these sundown towns, and for those of you who don't know, sundown towns were all white communities and they were all white on purpose. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But I was at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles when I saw my first Green Book, which was a black travel guide that was published during the Jim Crow era. And so I ran outside of the Autry and I called my parents. And that's my mom and my stepfather. And I asked my mom, I said, have you heard about this thing called the Green Book? This was 2013, so it was way before the movie came out. And she said no, she hadn't. But my stepfather, Ron, who picked up when we had landlines, he picked up from down his man cave. And he knew what the Green Book was. He grew up in the Jim Crow South in Tennessee. And it started a really special relationship I'd never had with him, because once I opened up the door to this history. He told me stories I had never heard before. So I was really, it was one of those moments where, you know, you look up at the sky and I was like, I'm kind of trapped in this writing a travel guide, which I'd never done before. And I did it because I needed the money. And I thought, wow, this is the project. It's about the Green Book. And I'd stumbled onto something special. So just to give you a background, the Green Book was, again, it was a travel guide that was published for black folks during the Jim Crow era. It was created by a man named Victor Hugo Green. There's Victor. He was a postal worker from Harlem. He had a 7th grade education. And we think that he was largely influenced by his friend, who was a Jewish man who used to use a kosher guide, and he would take, they had Jewish travel books that he would take up north from Harlem. He'd go to upstate New York, to the Borscht Belt, and Victor thought, well, this could be useful for black folks, because even in Harlem, in the 30s, it was still largely segregated. And most of 125th Street, that main drag in Harlem, still about half the businesses, there were rules or issues about whether you should be in that store or where you should sit in a theater. And so he thought this would even help me in my daily life. So he created this thing called the Green Book. It was 1936, was the first edition. And I've cataloged over 11,000 businesses that were listed in the Green Book. It was dubbed like a AAA guide for black people, but it went far beyond a AAA guide because it had everything, not just food and lodging. There were tailors and drugstores and beauty shops, and even real estate offices were in the Green Book. It was incredible. And there were articles in the Green Book that were really beautifully laid out, especially for the time. If you want to ever look through the Green Books, you can just Google New York Public Library, and if you put in Green Book, they've digitized about 24 editions, and you can flip through them and see how extensive they were. And it was incredible that it had such a wide reach, because even though it started as this small zine in 1936 in Harlem, it grew very fast, and largely that was due to Esso service stations. Standard Oil at the time, they distributed the Green Book, and they were on the right side of history this time. They had black men actually franchise their own gas stations, not just work in them. They hired black marketing executives that Victor Green worked very closely with, and they even hired black chemists at every level of the company. They did this, and I asked myself, well, why? So I went to Texas, to the archives, to get the story, and I think it comes down to Laura Spellman. She was Rockefeller's wife, and she, I think, was his conscience, and I think she was the pressure that the company needed. She grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, on the Underground Railroad. Her parents were fierce, fierce abolitionists. Spelman College, the HBCU, is actually named after their family. So I think she's the reason why, one of the main kind of pressure points that this company needed to do the right thing. There were also, Victor Green was a master marketer, even though he had a 7th grade education. He was a letter carrier, so he worked for the Postal Union, and it was segregated union like most things were at the time. And what was fascinating is that, instead of it being this liability, he kind of used it to his advantage. And so since the black postal workers had black neighborhoods that they served, he would have them bring Green Books. And that's how he got businesses to advertise in the Green Book. It was free unless you wanted a larger space or a larger ad. So it was a win-win. And it grew because of this and because of Esso. The first few years of the publication grew from, again, primarily in Harlem to listings in every state east of the Mississippi River. And it also went international. It spanned the US, it was in Europe and Bermuda, 33 countries in Africa had listings in the Green Book. So by 1962, it was this kind of multi-pronged marketing strategy that had a circulation of nearly 2 million people is what we estimate. The other thing I wanted to kind of let you know about the kind of sense of humor that the Green Book had. I'm just going to read a few of them. It says, demand half the road, the middle half, insist on your rights. Never look around you when you back up, there's never anything behind you. Never stop, look, or listen at railroad crossings, it consumes time. Always lock your brakes when skidding, it makes the job more artistic. So, and I love that there was this, even though when we think about this history and it seems very grim and scary and isolating and dangerous, and it was, but again, for the Green Book to have this levity and just, resiliency was really inspiring to me. I wanted to also let you know that the Green Book was not the only black travel guide. There were nearly a dozen of these travel guides, and they went from the 1930s to the early 1970s. Green Book wasn't the first one. Hackley and Harrison's in the middle, that was the first black travel guide. It was only published for 1 year. The Green Book, as I said, came out in 1936 and was published nearly 3 decades. The last edition was 1967. It took a hiatus during the war, but it was mostly an annual guide. And it was we're talking about the Green Book today because it was in publication for the longest period of time, and we do believe it was the most popular. So now I'm going to tell you about the type of people who were using the Green Book. There were all kinds of black people, right, living in the country at that time, and there were migrants who were fleeing racial terror in the South. The second wave of the Great Migration was underway, so you've got millions of black folks leaving the South, looking for other opportunities and safer places to live. You've also got Dust Bowl migrants that were fleeing the Depression. They weren't using the Green Books, but it was this, the idea of Route 66 being this kind of road of dreams. It symbolized this pathway to easier times and moving west. So Route 66 was one of the few U.S. highways that was laid out diagonally. It was kind of like the shortcut to freedom. There were also wealthy black folks who were using the Green Book. A lot of famous musicians relied on the Green Book. The Chitlin circuits that were really popular didn't have a traditional guide. That was something they used in the South, but the Green Book was the best way to make sure that you could get a meal and find a place to sleep if you were even a famous musician. And then there were just regular black folks who wanted to take a vacation like anybody else. And, the reality of what you were facing when you left your home, especially if you were black, you didn't know. You had to be prepared. Loading up the car was very different for black folks on a road trip. You had portable toilets that you brought. There was bedding. There were gas cans, obviously ice coolers and shoebox lunches. Even Coca-Cola machines would say white customers only on them. So you really had to be, again, resilient and prepared. And yet, they just went anyway, And I think that's, again, something that was so inspiring to me, that despite whatever they were facing, if you ran into a sundown town, it could be the last day on Earth. So it was very dangerous, and I just found so much inspiration in the folks who continued to travel. So this is just a quick, kind of map of just what the segregation was like in 1950s during the height of the Route 66. 6 of the 8 states that lined Route 66 enforced they had segregation laws, but they enforced them differently. So again, black folks had no idea what to expect. Jim Crow had no borders, is what they learned, especially those that were fleeing the South. And even in California, a state with no formal segregation laws, had segregated beaches. And the sundown suburbs of Burbank and Glendale and Culver City, there was a pool that in Pasadena that was basically it was closed to black folks except on Wednesdays because that was the day before they were going to clean the pool. So there were all of these rules that, again, weren't necessarily written down. So if you were traveling, how would you really know? And there were things like sundown towns. This is a sign, example of what would be printed on a sign. And there was no sundown town map, so you wouldn't know if you had maybe passed the sign on the way into town and missed it. Some sundown towns had a bell that they would ring at 6 o'clock, and that was your cue. If you were a black laborer and you were in the town, if you were part of that community for whatever reason, you still had to leave by 6 p.m. So they would have bells and, signs that said, "Don't let the sun set on you here." But then there was, Route 66. And I think that, connecting the urban and the rural, from Chicago to Los Angeles, it crossed 8 states and 3 time zones. So if you were really going to take Route 66, again, you were really you had to know that you couldn't know everything, right? And that you had to have this kind of spirit of how you were going to deal with anything that came your way. But then you also had this, energy that you were going to actually try and enjoy yourself. So I'm just going to take you through some of the traveling towards the west from the east. So South Center department store in Bronzeville, Chicago, because Chicago was one of those cities that there were actually no Green Book sites on Route 66, but Chicago had a lot of Green Book sites in the city. And so a lot of times black folks, you go to the Bronzeville South Center department store to load up on all kinds of things that you might need. And you would have to go to Springfield, Illinois, which was over 180 miles away, before there were any other Green Book sites on Route 66. On your way there, you'd pass through Cicero, which was a suburb of Chicago. It was also a sundown town. And this is footage of a 1951 mob of roughly 4,000 people who firebombed a building after black folks moved, or they tried to rent an apartment there. There's the Imperial Hotel on the way to Springfield. You hadn't gotten to Springfield yet, so this town of Pontiac was quaint town, straight out of Norman Rockwell. It wasn't a sundown town, but again, the theaters were segregated. Black people weren't allowed in the lobbies of the Imperial Hotel, pictured here, unless they were there to clean them. And then there was Chancellor's Lounge, though, and so that was in Springfield, Illinois, and that was a really popular Green Book site that you could go to. Springfield had 26 Green Book listings. There were 13 tourist homes, 3 beauty parlors, 2 service stations, 4 taverns. And I don't know if any of you know what tourist homes were, but they were, actually they were among the first Airbnbs. We did that. They were run by widowed women, largely, and they were women who had an extra bedroom and knew how to cook and served a lot of different kinds of people. It was really great for, again, those migrants and sharecroppers that were moving north who may have not had money. But it was a place where it was kind of like a B&B kind of atmosphere, but it was really taking your home and renting out a room to people who needed it. Missouri was one of those states that had about 200 sundown towns. And the idea that sundown towns were just a southern construct is just simply not true. The southern area of the country had the fewest number of sundown towns. They were large, they were much more popular in the Midwest and in the West, north of this. And I think the reason is, when you think about how segregation worked in the South, and things had been done a certain way for so many hundreds of years, that it was pretty clear where you should and shouldn't be. And so in the North, when things started opening up and people started traveling, and there were things like green books, it made it very confusing for the people in the North. So they were like, we have to figure, they used redlining and urban renewal and other government constructs to segregate the races. So sundown towns were this kind of very fast way of saying, hey, we don't want you here, because there was no real municipality that had structured laws at that point. But if you were moving on to St. Louis, this was a good place to stop if you were black, because there were about 250 green book sites. And there was nightclubs, beauty parlors, there was a taxi cab service, there was a bank. Banks were in the green book, which was pretty fascinating. This is an ad that was in the green book for a bank in St. Louis. But then you might also find, Fantastic Caverns, which again was a very popular green book site. It was a popular site, but it was a drive-through cave, and it wasn't in the green book because it was actually owned by the Ku Klux Klan. And they had cross burnings inside of the main area. It was quite spectacular in their way. And the Klan no longer runs it. Their Fantastic Caverns is still around today, and the Klan no longer runs it. But this was an example of why traveling Route 66 might feel like a minefield if you were black, because you just didn't know what was up ahead and what you might run into. And of course, this was a time when, we had segregation in our military. There was an area that near Rolla, Missouri, that a lot of soldiers were stationed, but they would drive 80 miles to go to Graham's tourist home if they were black, because that's where they could, have a good meal and listen to good music. And it was owned by black operators. Pearl Bailey and Little Richard were regulars there. And then, or you could go to Springfield, Missouri, and Alberta Ellis. Her Alberta Shack was really popular. She had purchased this defunct hospital, and it was like $10,000. Nobody assumed that she would be able to get it because it was supposed to go to this wealthy white man, but she showed up with cash and bought it right out from under it was just this, it was quite exciting. And she turned it into a hotel, a beauty salon, a nightclub. It was called the Rumpus Room. She also purchased 10 acres of land just right outside of the city to grow produce for the hotel, restaurant. It was amazing. This is one of her photos of guests leaving. And it was a family-run operation. The Drifters would hang out there. A young Stevie Wonder would go there. The Harlem Globetrotters, all kinds of folks. And then there's also 3 Filling Station, which some of you may know about. It's in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Oklahoma. North of that, it's called Luther, small town. They would fuel up at Threat Filling Station. Threat Filling Station is how you pronounce it. And they were around from like 1915 to the 1950s. This family homesteaded about 160 acres of land, and they built this gas station from a quarried sandstone on their property. It's been recently rehabbed, thankfully. We almost lost it. So that was pretty amazing. And this actually was not in the Green Book, but they did serve black travelers. So there were a lot of, because there was no internet, right? So it was really hard to have every single business that was black or friendly to black folks or owned by black folks in the Green Book. But this is an example of one that, was one of the most popular filling stations on Route 66 and actually served black folks and was run by a black family. The town right next to it, though, Edmond, was a sundown town, and this was their postcard where they actually wrote right on it, "Good place to live, 6,000 live citizens, no Negroes." Or you might find this sign in Veneta, Oklahoma's right outside of Claremore. And of course, there was a Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma that was pretty legendary because they had 42 Green Book sites, and the Tulsa Race Massacre actually predates the Green Book, but it was really important because the Greenwood district was this vibrant black community. More than 600 black businesses were there. There were black physicians and surgeons and lawyers, and there were grocery stores and libraries and hospitals and a black bus line. Some of the black residents were millionaires. They owned private planes. Booker T. Washington dubbed this the Black Wall Street. And then, of course, for those of you who know, there was a riot and a massacre that it was burned down. And, this was about 5 years before the birth of Route 66. And long-held resentments from white folks, who just were not okay with that much prosperity going on. And there were pockets of what we would call Black Wall Streets throughout the country. Tulsa wasn't the only one. But if you achieved too much success, there was a backlash possibly waiting for you. And there was 16 hours of rioting. Hundreds died. About 10,000 black people were left homeless, and about 35 blocks were burned. So now we're in Albuquerque, and so by the time you drive, from Chicago and you're going west, it was about a 350-mile stretch that there were only maybe 3 cities that had Green Book accommodations. So once black folks were reaching Albuquerque, they were getting into accidents. And the Albuquerque Tribune reported, in 1955, the state police chief just kept wondering, he's like, why are all these, it must be, they're just speeding. Why are they speeding? Or they must be just too tired. And an NAACP representative, Edward Boyd, said, it's because they can't find a place to stay. And because they've been driving through several states without any rest, and motels are consistent in their refusal to accommodate Negroes. And we know this for many reasons, but when you look at Central Avenue here in Albuquerque, there were about more than 100 motels and hotels that served Route 66 folks, but only about 6 of those actually served black folks. And if you didn't have a Green Book, how would you know where to go? It was one of those moments where you have to look at places like the De Anza. Again, this was not in the Green Book, but they served black folks. It was owned by a Zuni, prominent Zuni trader. And the property was, it sat abandoned for decades. And we almost lost it. But it was actually used in Breaking Bad. Walter White, he throws out his spare tire to hide cash from some drug deal. His wife is in the hospital. That's where they filmed it. So it's been used for these kind of bizarre reasons. But today it's developed into luxury apartments. So, at least we still have it. I've been documenting, I've cataloged over, like I said, a little over 12,000 Green Book sites now and others that weren't in the Green Book. But the Motel du Beau is, again, we have to support and honor and recognize these places that are still around because we've lost more than 80% of them, and less than 3% are actually still operating, so under their original names. There's Motel du Beau, which was in Flagstaff, again, another place that was not in the Green Book but served black folks on Route 66. And then there were the Harvey houses, which were pretty amazing. And they weren't in the Green Book, but they did serve black people. And that was pretty special. And I'm glad to see that, here at the exhibit you had a homage to the Harvey houses, because they revolutionized not just train travel, but in the late 1800s, they had fine dining restaurants in places where, you could eat oysters, where there was no refrigeration in other parts of the town. So it was such a luxury to have that kind of food available to you while you were on the train. And this was one of the first national restaurant chains in America. So, it's pretty amazing. One of the Harvey houses, the El Navajo, was in the Green Book. And those of you who don't know Mary Coulter, she was Harvey's architect and designer, and she's incredible to research. But again, this was a Green Book site. One of my favorites was Murray's Dude Ranch. The fact that there was a Negro Dude Ranch was just pretty amazing. And you were driving through the Black Mountains, right? These really twists and hairpin turns, and again, it was dangerous. And so the first place you would land if you had a Green Book was Victorville, and you could go to Murray's Dude Ranch. This was a 40-acre property in the Mojave Desert. It was owned by a black couple. It was one of the first places that black and white kids swam together in that part of the country. It was fully integrated. And it was very, very, very popular. Life magazine did a huge feature on it. Ebony, the cover of Ebony magazine. Lena Horne and Joe Louis were regulars. It was just quite spectacular. There were 2 westerns that were filmed at Murray's. Harlem Rides a Range and the Bronze Buckaroo. And you can actually, if you Google these, you can see them on, they're on YouTube. Just again, quite fabulous. And Pearl Bailey actually buys the ranch from the couple there. They were, Nola and Leela Murray were the original owners, and then they sell it to Pearl Bailey for $65,000 in 1955. So that's fabulous, and there's stories about her driving her pink Cadillac on the dirt roads around there. And then, towards the end of Route 66, we get to Clifton's. That was actually the original terminus point, was at 7th and Broadway in downtown Los Angeles. Now they extended it to to the beach, Santa Monica, but Clifton's was pretty fabulous, and it looks like we're going to lose it. It was rehabbed and opened, and now when I was just in LA a few weeks ago, it doesn't look like it's going to reopen after having some trouble with the pandemic, and it's really too bad. But Clifford Clinton was the man who owned the Green Book, or owned Clifton's, and he was quite special because he was the son of missionaries. He had traveled to China. He had witnessed brutal, abject poverty, and he thought, in America, a country with so much wealth, his family owned restaurants, and when he owned restaurants, he thought, I'm never going to turn anybody away because they can't afford the food. And so that's what he did, and even on the menu, it said, pay what you wish, dine free unless delighted. So you just paid, I guess, what you thought the food was worth. His business partners were horrified. They were like, we'll never make it. And they did, and they had a quite prosperous, incredible business that was very lucrative. It was a huge space. There was 5 floors. You walk through this wood paneled tunnel, and there were like this singing birds in this fake redwood forest. It was bizarre, but it was fabulous. Jack Kerouac and Walt Disney were regulars, Ray Bradbury. And it was just a perfect place. I mean, if you think you're driving Route 66 to end your journey here, it was almost a surreal place. And again, I think also a testament to what businesses are able to do if they have the desire to, and just the guts to share some of their profits. right? So now we're at the end of Route 66, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my journey. And, I've driven over 100,000 miles. I've taken over about a dozen trips documenting Green Book sites. I run a pretty tight ship. I travel alone. I scout up to about 30 sites a day. And since most of them are gone, there were times I would drive for days and not find a single one. So it was just a really great, I'm still doing this research, but 90% of it's done. But yeah, when you see the scars of urban renewal, that's when I would drive for, I'd find just a highway that would have covered where 20 or 30 Green Book sites would have been, right? And so for those of you who aren't familiar with urban renewal, it was Eisenhower's federal highway system. These projects spanned across the country, and they decimated black communities. The U.S. government seized many Green Book sites under the kind of statute of eminent domain, and these businesses were bulldozed to make way for progress. But even Tulsa's Greenwood district wasn't spared. So this is where you see, I think it's Highway 244 that bisects right through the Greenwood district. And then Route 66 was decommissioned in 1984. So ironically, it was the same interstate highway system that decimated black communities that also killed the mom and pops on Route 66. And, when you go through, by the 1960s, there were 5 interstates that bypassed all those small Route 66 towns, and they've yet to recover. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation has listed Route 66 as America's most endangered historic places. And we can also see, again, this nostalgia, this kind of immortalizing this, this past that never really was, getting your kicks on Route 66. And when you think about people like Nat King Cole, who sang the anthem, I mean, he made it, so the reason why we still can have that song in the back of our heads, but it was the redlining and racial covenants that actually prevented him from actually buying a house in Hancock Park in LA. So, it's this dichotomy of, kind of what happens to us as black folks is eventually what happens to all of us in this country. So again, this microcosm of what Route 66 can teach us, I think is hopefully, I don't know when or if we'll learn this lesson. So we're still having the protests, the then and now, right? And, I don't know what acknowledging the truth of the past really looks like today, but it is, again, this chilling reminder that progress is not linear. Things don't get better just because time moves on. When you say, oh, it's 2026, we should be X, Y, Z, it's like, well, these things come back around. And, part of why I wrote my book, Overground Railroad, was to show this pendulum of justice and when things do move forward and we do have progress. And then there's always a backlash, right? So then we always feel like we're going back even though we kind of made all this progress. And I think that's what really helps me deal with this moment and think about this moment differently. Again, in Overground Railroad, I think to me, I have to remind myself that America is still a young country. This is still an experiment that is not quite proven to work yet. Democracy is fragile. We are not entitled to it. So I'm just going to end by reading a short passage that I wrote in the book. It says, "This is not a book about the history of road tripping and black travel. It's more of a pilgrimage toward understanding a country so blinded by symbolism that it can't or won't tackle the pervasive, relentless forces that created the environment for the Green Book to thrive in the first place. It is a book that I hope will show us how we got here and why, after all this time, we still have so far to go." Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Oh, thank you. So I think we're doing a Q&A, is that correct? Do you know if there's going to be mics or just people will just speak? Okay, great. Sue, I remember you.
Testing, okay. If somebody will raise their hand if
Just
they have a
Sue
question.
is up here in the front. Wait for
Oh,
the mic.
let's,
There's a mic coming.
because we're recording. Please.
You mentioned the black mail carriers handed out the green books. Were they free for everybody? Could you pick one up in an Esso station for free? And how often were they revised?
Right. They weren't free, but they started at a quarter and went up to about $1.75, I think, by the 60s. However, when the letter carriers did take them out to the businesses, they would usually give them a pack of them. So also they're porters that, the black men who did a lot of in the train travel, they would carry green books with them. So they weren't necessarily free, but they were accessible. And yeah, the Esso stations would distribute them, but they would sell them. So it was one of those, I think, and we're always guessing in terms of, how many were really sold. But versus, I did see Victor Green's original, like his income statements and he was never a rich man. He didn't make a lot of money off of this, but he did make, and he's continued to be a letter carrier into the 50s. So he dies in 1960, so he doesn't even see the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and his wife Alma takes over the Green Book. So, it has a long history, but yeah, it wasn't really a money-making enterprise.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mandisa Rothini with Juneteenth Renaissance Institute. I just want to first thank you for your work. We've done a lot of research around this because we're doing activations here in Albuquerque, Chicago, Oklahoma City, in the black neighborhoods that have been divested from. You touched on that, so thank you. And the research has been disparate to kind of pull it all together. Like I found in the research that my ancestor had a hotel that was in the Green Book there. So there's things, it's all over
That's
the place. Or
amazing.
you find that people have been planning Route 66 celebrations for like 15 years and leaving out these neighborhoods for 15 years, right? So that's where my question comes from, is in our work. I'm definitely going to read your book, but I heard you say like the most endangered. What are you seeing federally and state by state that people can use now to activate these neighborhoods? Because they have the history, they have stories, they have voice, and they have great futures too, right? So I'm just really interested in how, if that came across in your research, if you had some ideas.
Can you just, again, I'm
Yeah.
missing, so what is are you talking about guides that were used then or today?
No, I'm wondering if you were able in your research to come to some conclusions. You mentioned, for example, about that, I forget who it was, I'm sorry, that they were saying it was the most endangered historic site.
The national, yeah.
Yes,
Right,
yes. And we see that, for example, there was the Centennial. I don't know if people know, there's federal
Right.
funds, state funds that have been coming down the pike, and black communities, indigenous communities, many communities have been left out of these conversations for about 15 years. So, if they talk about like the International District, I know you're not from Albuquerque, but we all know the International District. They've been forgetting it before all this other stuff, no matter what they want to say. So,
So
I'm
you're
just
asking
wondering.
about preservation
Uh,
efforts of businesses?
Yeah, preservation or even neighborhoods just reactivating, because that's what my nonprofit is working on.
Right, right.
And we're using the Route 66 part, the memorabilia,
Sure.
this energy as part of the catalyst for these businesses. Because
Right.
first of all, it's what built the neighborhoods, which you touched on, thank you so much. And there's so much opportunity still. So I'm just
Right.
wondering what you came across and,
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, I got a grant from the National Park Service to bring, awareness and actually get some of these businesses on the National Register in some of the communities in the districts, right? Because a lot of times they may have a collection of businesses that need to be saved or have some kind of historical and cultural value. And because each state is so different in terms of their requirements, it's a quagmire because you can't get a specific, and a lot of these businesses were built in traditional black neighborhoods that were, again, either built in floodplains or areas that made it very difficult to keep these these structures pristine. So when you go by the old rules of what makes a business or a structure worthy of preservation, because it's a multi-million-dollar venture usually, it costs a lot of money, a lot of times they have these pristine architectural rules that these primarily black businesses didn't fit, because again, if you were built in a floodplain, there were a lot of modifications that had to happen to those businesses. So my work with the National Park Service was to at least write a context saying, it is worthy of preservation and to be listed on the National Register simply because it was in the Green Book or simply because it was in a black travel guide. So it didn't have to go through those that same criteria, that it could never, this is why we've lost so many of them. But I did it for the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Office, but ran into so many problems because each state had so many different rules and regulations. And then, of course, once you get into community neighborhood stuff, as you know, I'm an outsider, right? But even within the interior kind of fighting between the historic district and the people who did have something going on. So they were already, when I walked in, they were already kind of arguing with each other about all kinds of stuff. So it was complicated and difficult. And I think most of that stuff works better on a very local level. The most successful preservation projects I've seen regarding Route 66 businesses were literally like there was one woman, Enid Pinkley, she was in her 70s, and there was this thing called the Hampton House in Miami, and she had gone there as a child or as a teenager and loved it, and ended up spearheading like a $9 million preservation project kind of on her own and got people involved. But, I think it's the local, kind of interest and also just passion that, saves these places. But I have not found a structural way to unfortunately, that you can replicate in other towns. That's complicated. Okay, who's next? Oh, hi.
Hey, I just wanted to say I moved here from Tulsa, so I appreciate the way that you covered Black Wall Street and urban renewal and everything. I also wanted to ask more about it because in Oklahoma, there were more than 50 all-black towns at this time of the Green Book, and I'm just wondering what research you kind of saw about that, because I feel like that's a very untold story of Route 66 in Oklahoma.
Yeah, black towns were fascinating, and I did some research. There was a colleague who we lost after COVID, and he was doing the premier research on black towns. But for those of you who don't know, there were these black towns that were all over the country that were, municipalities. They ran, and actually one was in the Green Book called Robbins. I forget what edition. I think it's a 1951 edition. Don't quote me on that, but if you look through the New York Public Library archives, they had an actual article about Robbins as black town. And in Oklahoma, that was a state that had the most number of black towns in the city, or in the country, and not really quite sure why. Some towns actually had reverse sundown town signs that were kind of fascinating, and it was kind of in reaction to the sundown towns. They weren't trying to be aggressive, but it was kind of like, we're going to do this too. But, I am not an expert on the black towns, but I just booked a speaking engagement in Oklahoma City that's happening, I think, in November 20th, and they're having an exhibit on the black towns in Oklahoma. So I'm not sure if you can get there, but they may have an online resource, but I'm gonna, I'm looking forward to that because it is kind of an under-researched area of study, and so I'm hoping to learn stuff too.
Hi, yes, hello. Hi. Thank you so much for the work that you've done. I'm actually on a road trip myself, a solo road trip from the South to now the Southwest and hopefully the Midwest, and actually have used the Green Book app, I believe, to help me figure out where it is like the safest place to stay as a young black woman. So I was wondering if you had any advice for solo traveling yourself as a black woman.
Oh, that's an interesting question. My stepfather, Ron, who I showed you, he becomes this kind of narrative arc in the book in Overground Railroad, and it's a long story, I won't go into it. But, he was this Marine and lots of testosterone. And so he taught me how to, and we never really connected because he was just such a manly man. I was just like, I don't get it. But once we started talking about Green Book stuff, we really became very close. And because he was in law enforcement too, so, I travel with the stun gun, I travel with mace. He gave me this knife that was really big, and I thought, this can't be legal. He was like, just tell them you're fishing. And I'm like, they're not going to believe that. They won't believe it. I took model mugging courses, which was really important, that muscle memory of how to fight. But I think more than anything, and I believe this, I think as a black woman, I have really good instincts. And I don't know if they come from my ancestors or what, but there are so many times when I'm in a place, and a lot of these Green Book sites are in, way under-resourced neighborhoods, and I just thought it's time to go. And even though I hadn't done all my work that day, and even though I had other stuff to do, I was like, as soon as I get that feeling, it's time to go, it's time to go. And I think that saved my life. I've been I've been, physically kind of lunged at, and, just minor attacks, like nothing really, life-threatening. But again, knowing when to go is the best, advice that I think, maybe you and I share. I just do believe it's ancestral. And I listen to my gut. I don't question it. Hi.
Yes. I was growing up in New Mexico and born in '46. I was pretty shocked to see that there was no place to stop from the border to Albuquerque. And I'm wondering if you've done research, like what percentage of hotels, let's say, did not allow black people to stay, and also white-owned properties. Surely there were a lot of people who were white, who owned restaurants and hotels, and were open. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping it was a minority that were closed, and not that were.
No, I think it was the other way. Most white businesses, even if, we see this in Victor Green's letters. There was, North Dakota actually was the very last state that would sign on to the Green Book. And so we found letters of him trying to get these white businesses to advertise in the guide. And they wouldn't. And even if, the manager or the owner wasn't necessarily racist, they would just say, we don't want to alienate our white customers. So it was this kind of groupthink idea that even if you weren't, a rabid segregationist, that a lot of folks kind of went with the times. And in terms of percentage, it's really almost impossible to know. But, I did estimate that about 85% of the Green Book sites were run by black people. A lot of Jewish people among the white proprietors that were Green Book listings, they were Jewish for probably obvious reasons, because they knew what it felt like to be, discriminated against. But there was, you can't really put yourself back in that time, but as much as we can, try and understand, and even though you see things shifting, right? So in the early editions of the Green Book, it was more like a black yellow pages, where there was everything you could think of. It was doctors and real estate offices and drugstores, if you needed your prescription filled. So it was really obvious how many places black folks were shut out of. And then when you get into the 50s, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, you start seeing things open up, and it looked like integration was inevitable, right? So you see the country changing, you see the Green Books changing. They don't look like these yellow pages anymore of just any kind of black business. they look more like AAA guides. So it's like lodging and food and things that you would need while you were traveling, because the presumption was you could go to a drugstore and get your prescription refilled. So you can see those things happening if you just, there's no real documents I can point to that say this was happening, but that's how, collectively when we look back at history, and I think that when you can see in this moment today too, how groupthink or, it's really difficult to get folks to compromise their livelihoods, to do the right thing. We're not wired that way generally. So I think it was true then.
So we're going to make this our last question.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I found it quite fascinating as a black woman who works in urban planning, and much of my research that I do focuses on transportation and how the history of transportation has really shaped communities today. I don't mean to alarm anyone, but there's, from the little that I have seen when I've read a few green books, different versions over different decades, and I do see a lot of subtleties, but certainly signs that we are regressing back into a deeply segregated nation. And I'm curious, from your experience and your research, what are some more nuanced things that you learned studying green books that you can see are really coming back, that we should be noting as warning signs so that we know how and just what areas in which small acts or that can easily become large acts that we need to be mindful of as we are headed in this aggressive state that we are?
I think when we're living through history, it's always more, it's harder to see, right, what's happening when we're in it. But historically, again, looking at how that pendulum of justice would swing forward, it's like, as soon as Barack Obama became president, I thought, okay, we need to stiffen up here because there's going to be a reaction to that. And so I think that normally, I've been finding things that, even when I did this research in 2015, a lot of these, I traveled to over 100 former sundown towns, right? So a lot of these places, and some of them have moved on, some of them have black mayors, some of them have really moved on. But and we see this now happening, right, in the kind of this voting, losing our voting rights and all of that. But I kind of got wind of this years ago when I was looking at these former sundown towns and how they do business, right? Because there was a lot of course, mass incarceration becomes that's part of my book, that's showing how how mobility is really thwarted under the system, right? So as soon as we get some control or get some, as soon as we find a way to become equal is when we get this backlash. And so in some of these former sundown towns, I would see where they would have so many black folks and brown folks that they were arresting in the cities and then bring them to this town that were formerly all white, and to increase their numbers, right, because they would get more legislation in Congress. There was like this bigger factor here, right? So when you would see that the Census Bureau would show black and brown folks, when you look closer, they were all in their prisons, mostly private prisons, right? So those are some of the layers of, I saw that happening in 2015, 2016, and then when you see how some of these small towns, how they gain legislature through DC, right, and they get more money, because they can increase their numbers. So there are these, and it's a similar trajectory of, the FHA loans and the redlining and the underhanded, those are the things that we really need to look out for. It's not the most overt things. When you look at the white and colored signs in the South, it was like, well, thank you for just being honest. The reality of the covert methods, that again, I think people like Sherilyn Ifill, I watch, I follow her a lot. She was kind of like the Thurgood Marshall of our times. And I think she's really wise because she understands the legal kind of maneuvering that goes on. And I think that's the thing that's more dangerous because a lot of times we're forced to look at the big shiny racist thing that's happening. And that's usually not the thing to be most afraid of. It's the things that are happening under our nose that then we wake up and realize. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's happening with the migrant detention centers and all of that, that has been happening in mass incarceration in our prisons for decades, right? So 30, 40 years. I mean, that would never happen today had we not done all of this 30, 40 years ago. So, there's nothing necessarily new here. I mean, and that's not comforting, but in some ways it is. Because if you do study history and you look at all of the, the legal maneuverings and underhanded, whether it's Robert Moses and, him building the, I mean, there's all these, it's all there. How we get it to a soundbite or how we get people motivated to understand what to do about it, I think is the big question that I don't think there's one answer. It's like trying to solve cancer. It's like you can't, there's just too many different ways to go about it, and there's too many different neighborhoods and communities that do things differently. So, study your history and be aware. Yeah, I'm
I
sorry,
think
guess
we
this
will
is the
go
last
ahead
one.
and wrap up at that. Thank you so much for today. We appreciate it. Woo, yes. Yay. So please meet us at the gift shop if you want to go ahead and get a book signed. Thanks.